We are in 1 Peter chapter 3. Last week in chapter 2, we studied submission. Submission to the government, masters and slaves. And Jesus showed complete submission to the Roman government. Now remember, Pilate did not want to put Jesus to death. But Pilate was a weak man, could not stand on the principle that he felt. And so he gave in to the Jews. Did the Roman soldiers crucify Jesus? Yes. They were just doing their duty. Was that a sin for the Roman soldiers? I don't think so. But for the people who wanted Jesus to be crucified, definitely a sin. But Jesus submitted to that. Didn't have to. I mean, in the civil picture, he didn't have to. But spiritually, he had to. And so he was willing to do that. Well, in chapter 3, we continue with the subject of submission, and he addresses wives. Why he gives much more attention to wives than to husbands, I don't know, but we'll see that that's the case. Likewise, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they, without a word, notice the word, a word, may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. Do not let your beauty be that outward adorning or arranging the hair, of wearing gold, or of putting on fine apparel. But let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible ornament of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. For in this manner, in former times, the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are, if you do good and are not afraid with any terror. Be submissive. That's not a very popular doctrine today. Not at all. But I think we can say that it's been God's plan from the very beginning. Genesis chapter 3, Eve had just been tempted. She gave in. She shared the fruit with Adam, and he gave in. And God speaks to Eve. Genesis 3 and verse 16, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Now, this passage does say that they're joint heirs, or some expression similar to that. Christianity elevated women tremendously. The New Bible Commentary, which is one that I use, said that in the first century, women and slaves were considered to be inferior beings. In other words, they were hardly human. That was their status. And we can think about submissive, but Roman women were absolutely subject to their husbands. So if a Roman woman became a Christian, as you see in this passage, that was a huge step. And there were risks involved there. Risk that her husband might divorce her or worse. So it was a big thing. But Peter indicates that the husband, unbeliever, perhaps could be brought to salvation. There's a similar idea in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 16. How do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Well, there are a lot of husbands who have been saved because they married a godly woman. I suspect there are fewer wives who have been saved because they married a godly man. Does that mean none of them? Absolutely not. But women in general, at least used to be, more spiritual than men. I think there are indications now among, I'm not very up on things, Gen Z, would they be around 20 years old? I hope so. I have seen surveys that young men of that age, are becoming more spiritually minded than women. That's a shock. And if it is, I don't know what ramifications that has for society, but I would think they might be positive. And this passage says that the husband doesn't respond to the word, which for us is this. Now granted, Peter didn't have all of it, but he had a lot of it. He had all the Old Testament. The husband doesn't respond to that. He doesn't respond to a word from the wife, so he doesn't respond to browbeating, but he sees the way she lives, her patience, her chaste behavior, and that can win him over because it demonstrates the gospel's impact upon her. Might make him more inclined to let it affect him. I'm sure in the early church the situation was common. Guaranteed so today. I'm confident that some of you ladies had a husband that would not come to church with you. It's a common thing. He talks about modesty. He's not talking about underdressing, which can be an issue. I mean, I think we all know that. He's talking about overdressing. There's nothing wrong with jewelry and fine clothing. Some versions in verse 3 say merely outward. Let your beauty be within. And if it is, then if you wear jewelry and nice clothes, that's quite all right. He is critical of extreme hairdos, which, of course, for some of us would be quite difficult. But very long hair that would be frequently wound around the head. So it might stick up that high. And just being covered with jewelry. Those are the things that he is criticizing. And I have not seen any woman here whom I would have thought was really over-jewelried. But in the first century, that was an issue. And the true adornment, he says, is a gentle spirit that is pleasing to God. He's talking to women, but that applies just as well to men. We should have a gentle spirit that pleases God. And we should not wear anything that draws attention to ourselves. I could be teaching this class with a bathing suit. Now, of course, Nancy calls me bird legs. So, probably true. But that would draw attention. We don't want to draw attention. I suppose the most flagrant thing that we would imagine today is a young woman in a very short, tight miniskirt and a plunging neckline. We don't often see that in worship. Aren't we glad? It's not appropriate for worship. They may feel that it is, but when you get gray hair or no hair, you realize that's not good at all. Don't draw attention to us, but demonstrate a spirit that is pleasing to God. He mentions Sarah. Sarah called Abraham her Lord in Genesis chapter 18 and verse 12. Her Lord, her master. She didn't call him her boss, but she recognized his authority. And faithful Jewish men considered themselves to be sons of Abraham. Faithful Jewish women thought they were daughters of Sarah. Now, as we discussed earlier, this book was written to a mixed audience. And I don't know how the Gentile members of the church felt about this conversation about Abraham and Sarah. Because they might feel, well, that doesn't relate to me. And at least ethnically it didn't. But spiritually, different story. So that's 6 verses to the women. What about the men? 1 verse, verse 7. Likewise, you husbands, dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. Well, treat wives with consideration. And there are verses that are much stronger than this. How about Ephesians 5, verse 25, where the instruction to husband was to love your wives as Christ loved the church. Well, it's hard to do that. That's a level of love that most of us can't muster up. But that should be the comparison. So it is beyond just dwelling with them with understanding. Some versions say according to knowledge. I suppose that's recognizing what God expects, to live with them in accordance with God's will. Raymond Kelsey, whom I mentioned before, said that Christians have God's revelation about marriage that the pagans did not have. And Christians know what God expects in a marriage. There are enough passages written to women and enough to men that we know what God's plan is. And he calls her the weaker sex. He is not talking about intellect. He is not saying men are smarter than women. He's just saying men are physically stronger than women. Absolutely? No, not absolutely. But 90 times out of 100, yes. And that's one of the major issues why transgendered men should not compete in athletics. Completely unfair. Particularly that guy, was he at Pennsylvania? tall, 6'3", 6'4". My word. Talk about cheating. That's what that is. And her being weaker doesn't automatically make him strong, especially in a spiritual matter. It's relative. And Peter says, don't let your prayers be hindered. Well, we kind of have to imagine what Peter means. But certainly disregarding the commands of God is sin. And if we have flagrant, ongoing sin in our lives, it's going to hinder our prayers. If we are constantly arguing in our marriage, which some couples do, every couple has disagreements, but some are continually arguing, and usually that marriage fails, but that would hinder prayer also. So he's finished with husbands. He starts talking about the church. Verse 8. Finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another, love as brothers, be tender-hearted, be courteous. So he wants the church to commit to a spirit of unity. I definitely say we have it here. This is a church of unity and not strife. We should be thankful to God for that. But commit to unity. Imitate Christ by being kind, tender-hearted, and forgiving. Well, that sounds like this verse. Actually, it's Ephesians 4 and verse 32. Direct command to the Ephesian church to be like Christ in that regard. Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 13 says, whoever rewards evil, who gives evil for good, evil will not depart from his house. Well, we've said before, we know it's true. What goes around comes around. The way you treat others will eventually come back to you. And he mentions as we go on, loving life. That's down in verse 10. We'll be there in a minute. I think he's talking about the life here, which for the Christian is definitely worth living, but he's also talking about the life to come. So commit to unity. Bless others, verses 9 through 12. Not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. And now he is going to quote Psalm 34, verses 12 through 16. He who would love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil, his lips from speaking guile. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous. His ears are open to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Bless other people. Numerous ways we can do that. We can be kind. I mean, we can take them a meal when they're sick or somebody died, something like that. But what Peter's talking about is more than that. By watching what we say, watching our words. Words can hurt. We all know that. We've been hurt. We've hurt others. If we watch what we say, we will bless others. We can do right, not do evil, but we can do right things. We can be a good example. We can pursue peace. Beautiful verse in Romans chapter 14 that sounds very similar to pursuing peace. Let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding. Because so often words tear down. We need to use words that build up. And really, before we can pursue peace for others, we've got to have peace in ourselves. We all know people who emotionally are not at peace. I'm sure that one time or another, numbers of us in here have felt that way. We were not at peace. And we know from experience that emotional issues often are very wearing, very, very debilitating on the person with them and the people around them. Pursue peace. It'll help in so many ways. And recognize here, that's the final verse, verse 12, whom God regards with favor. Well, the eyes of God are upon the righteous for protection. But the eyes of God are on evildoers with disapproval. You know that kind of look that your mother could give to you when you were 7 years old and doing something you weren't? That may be the way the eyes of God are on the wicked. He notices them, but not with favor. And the idea of sinners not being heard is stated most clearly in John chapter 9 and verse 31. It was not stated by Jesus, but by the blind man who was healed. Now we know, he's blind man talking, that God does not hear sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Perhaps with a understanding of what the word sinners meant in that day, the way it was used, this statement by the blind man might be completely true. If our lives are one of rebellion against God, I think we very clearly fall under the end of verse 12. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil. He does not listen to their prayers. But if a person is, living a decent life and feels, I need God in my life, is he a Christian at that point? No. But will God listen to a prayer like that? Absolutely. Sinners is the idea. Unrepentant, continuing. God doesn't hear those people. Proverbs 28:9 basically says that. One who turns his ear away from listening to the law, even his prayer is an abomination. So have unity within the church. And when you face persecution, in effect, he says, make the best of it. That's verses 13 through 17. Who is he who will harm you if you become followers of what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. And do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that's in you, with meekness and fear, having a good conscience, that when they defame you as evildoers, those who revile your good conduct in Christ may be ashamed. For it is better, if it is the will of God, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. He's really kind of returning to a thought, the latter part of chapter 2, about persecution and how Jesus bore up and endured it. Blessings will flow from being persecuted. How do we know that? Well, we know that from what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. That's what Peter is talking about. And persecution, which other than words, I doubt any of us have experienced, it may injure. It may injure grievously. There have been Christians in India whose cars have been firebombed with them in it, and they burned to death. That would be bad. Definitely an injury. Killing. But for a Christian in the ultimate sense, because God is watching over them, there's no ultimate harm, because heaven is the destination. And verse 13 indicates that most people won't harm Christians for doing good. That's probably true. But verse 14 says, well, there may be some exceptions, but God will bless us in that circumstance. In an old commentary that I used called Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown, they were Presbyterians, I think. Here's a quote. I think we'd agree with this entirely. It is better for us also once to suffer with Christ, whatever form that takes, than forever without Christ. We now are suffering our wants. It will soon be a thing of the past, a bright consolation to those who are tried. What did Jesus say? Don't fear those who can kill the body. Fear him who can kill both body and soul in hell. So if we're persecuted, which probably for us will be words, bear up under it. Act in a Christian way. Don't go on the attack against the person who's berating you. Never works. We need to be ready, this is verse 15, to defend our hope. And we need to do it gently and reverently, which in my mind includes don't ridicule the spiritual leanings of someone else. If we immediately start saying, well, your church is wrong because this, that, and the other, that's no way for our study to carry on. So don't ridicule it, but make your position known. And doing so may shame your opponent. You're not deliberately doing it that way, it just happens that way. The fact that we could tell people our hope is in Christ, That's definitely an answer. It's true. It may not be very filled out, if you will, but the reason for our hope is that it is not based on ourselves. It is based upon Jesus and his righteousness. We don't need to have a very long, well-reasoned proof for our hope. That would demand a lot of us. And also, people have short attention spans. You know what's done it to them? Those phones. People wouldn't stand around and wait for you to give a 20-minute dissertation. They're not going to want that. Their minds will be gone before the end of it. But sort of relating to that, William Barclay wrote in his commentary, our faith must be a first-hand discovery and not a second-hand story. It is one of the tragedies of the modern situation that there are so many church members who, if they were asked what they believe, could not tell. And who, if they were asked why they believe it, would be equally helpless. The Christian must go through the mental and spiritual toil of thinking out his faith so that he can tell what he believes and why. It doesn't take a long dissertation. It doesn't take a book. But a couple of minutes, you could say a lot about where your faith is grounded. Burton Kaufman, preacher in the Church of Christ, died about 20 years ago, said that a Christian should have a full grasp of the basis for his faith. Now, that would not apply to a young Christian, but we should mature to that so that we do have it. And I mentioned shaming opponents. Jesus did that at Calvary. Luke is the only gospel writer to record it, but it's in Luke 23 and verse 48. Jesus had died. There were these events, you remember, the veil of the temple, the skies becoming dark, and people went away beating their breasts. Had he shamed them? Absolutely, he had shamed them. And they knew what they had done. And remember on the day of Pentecost when Peter preached the first sermon, and he told those Jews, "You did it." Did they argue? Did they say, "No, we didn't"? No. Instead, they said, "Men and brethren, what shall we do to take away the blame of that sin?" And Jesus was suffering for the sins of others. He was dying to bring mankind to God. And how do we sanctify him in our hearts? We acknowledge him as holy, because he's desired to bring us to God, and we want to act like it. Now, what time is it? Well, we can introduce it. Probably one of the most confusing passages in the New Testament. Christ preaching to spirits in prison, starting verse 18. Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit, by whom also he went and preached to the spirits in prison, who formerly were disobedient, when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 souls, were saved through water. Christ preached to the spirits in prison. Well, what does that mean? It wasn't necessarily during his time in the grave. I mean, he went to paradise. He was there perhaps 36 hours or a little more, and then he was out. Did he do it in that time frame? Maybe, maybe not. Does this mean, when he's talking to the spirits in prison, that he is giving them a chance to become right with God? I don't think so. There is a second chance interpretation put on this passage by some. But that's counter to some other scriptures. Like Hebrews chapter 9 in verse 27, it is appointed to man once to die, and then comes judgment. Doesn't indicate a second chance anywhere. There are commentators who say that he was preaching to fallen angels. So they are assuming he was preaching, but to fallen angels and not to people. And others say that he proclaimed either the gospel or doom, one or the other, to the sinful dead. Well, what would have been the purpose of that? So that one doesn't really seem good. There's no indication anywhere that he took these people to paradise with him. And I found it interesting. I looked up purgatory in the Catholic online encyclopedia. It has an article about purgatory, purging, if you will. It does not reference this chapter, which seems a little odd to me, but purgatory also seems a little odd to me. And the Catholic encyclopedia acknowledges that you do not find the word purgatory in the scriptures. And they defined it as being for venial sins. 2 categories of sins: mortal, venial. Mortal is bad, okay. It could be fatal. That's really the meaning. Venial is just whatever. It's not for a big deal. And purgatory is for venial sins, little sins, not repented of. And the scripture reference there is in 1 John chapter 5. And when you go back there where John says, there is a sin that I don't say that you should pray for. He talks about mortal sins back there. So how would Christ have preached to them if he didn't do it himself? Most conservative commentators that I have seen say that he did it through Noah, at the time of Noah, while the ark was being built. Because Noah is described, 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5, as a preacher of righteousness. Now, did he make any converts? Not outside of his family. But his family was saved with him in the ark. Well, that's positive. Everybody else ignored him. Or probably worse than that, they probably made fun of him. Noah, what are you working so hard on? Goodness. You've been working on that for years. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to park it in your garage? I mean, it's 450 feet long. I'm sure people were making fun of Noah. But when the rain started, they didn't make fun of him anymore. We will stop here because 321 introduces another very important section.